G'day and welcome to more Space Engineers Testing. Today we're going to take a look at wheel suspension. I have a lot of fun playing around with these things, but to be completely honest, nearly all of my setups have been pretty much done through trial and error. I haven't really looked into how each of the sliders on the wheel suspension works, and specifically what effects they will have. I've just kind of gotten to a result I'm, reasonably happy with through a bit of luck and a lot of trial. And even more error. That made me think that it might be about time for me to learn these things properly and to understand the settings in some degree of detail so that I can hopefully think what I need and get there. And when you think about suspension, one of the main things you want is to keep all of your 4, 6, 8, 12, however many wheels you've got in contact with the surface they're on, allowing you to have maximum turning ability and maximum braking and accelerating abilities, and keeping the vehicle stable while on a bumpy or rough or hilly or whatever surface that you happen to be moving on at the time. Let's have a quick look before we head through this tunnel at the settings that are available. We've got our usual stuff at the top, turning them on and off, and we've got a safety lock speed. This is something that was implemented to attempt to avoid clang and things exploding, and when you hit that speed, the wheels will simply lock up entirely so that you don't have, so that you theoretically don't have as many issues with subgrids, as the wheels are subgrids like the attachments to rotors that we went through in the rotors video. We've also got a button to replace a wheel if it happens to pop off, which is very handy. A toggle for whether the wheels are involved in steering or not. Depending on how you want your vehicle set up, if you've got something that's going to act a bit like a normal car that's going to travel at reasonable speeds, you're probably going to want front wheel steering. That tends to be safer at higher speeds, at least in the real world. In Space Engineers, that may or may not be true. I guess you'll have to test it out. Steering angle is how far the wheels are going to steer. So we can demonstrate that if we change our left wheel suspension steering angle to 46 degrees and we'll leave the right one where it is. If we look from above, our left wheel is turning a whole lot further than our right one. And that's that steering angle. You could imagine if I'm going along at high speed and I turn that far, that wheel could very easily catch and cause me to roll or flip. So you'll want to adjust that to somewhere reasonable for whatever speeds you're traveling at. Also, there's these two settings, steering speed and steer return speed. So we'll crank those up to maximum and have a look at the comparison between the left and right now. If you look, as I press the A and D keys, you can see that the left wheel is snapping into position very quickly, whereas the right is moving a bit more casually, a bit more sedately. It's just taking its time. And that's because the right wheel has only 1 Newton meter of force applied to turn it, whereas the left one has 10. We also adjusted the steer return speed, which is how forcefully the wheel will return to its neutral position. You can invert your steering so that the steering angle changes to the opposite direction, so you can go cross-eyed, or whatever that one's called. I can't think of a specific time I've ever had to use that, but it's there if you somehow figure out a reason why you're going to need it. You can choose whether all of your wheels are affected by trying to move forward. So imagine this like rear wheel drive, front wheel drive, or all wheel drive on a vehicle, on a normal car. So we could remove propulsion from our front wheels and make this a rear wheel drive vehicle. If we do that, and looking from above, if we turn off the park brakes, you should see that the rear wheels will kind of spin, whereas the front wheels will only move to follow the terrain. You can also invert the propulsion, which may be useful again if your wheels somehow end up driving or attempting to push the car in the wrong direction. You could switch around those wheels that for some reason or another are doing that to you. Then we get down to these sliders. these are the ones that you're going to be playing around with the most, I suspect. You've got your power setting, which is how much force is going to be applied to try and spin that particular wheel. The power is set up as a percentage, so from 0 to 100 of whatever the maximum force this thing can create is. What we would expect to have happen if we drop our left-sided propulsion down to 10% and we put our right-sided propulsion up to 100%, is that when we start accelerating, we're going to turn left. Let's see if that happens. I'm just going to accelerate and we'll see if we start going left. Well, that hill just made it cheated, didn't it? I probably should have set up this test on some really flat ground. But let's try and make this test even more convincing. Let's try going uphill and... yeah, let's try that one more time, going a proper uphill. The land is sloping up to the left, but the car's still wanting to go up that way because those right-sided wheels are turning with much more force than the left-sided ones. Most of the time you're going to want these to all be set the same, I would suspect. You're going to need to vary your power dependent on the terrain you're on. If you're on steep hills, you're going to want more power so that you can actually even get up them, but you can also affect how easily that can be achieved with your friction. These two work together. Power is how much force is applied to the wheel. Friction is how much of that force is applied to try and move your vehicle forward. It's also the force that tries to keep your vehicle heading in the direction that the wheels are going. So, if we have our friction very low, we're going to have trouble accelerating because our wheels are just going to spin in place. If we turn, it's going to have no effect because those wheels aren't able to grip onto the ground. And also, we're not going to be able to brake, so we probably want to fix that before I smash into a wall. The way the car moved just then, I may as well be driving on a slip and slide. I will have no control at all. Sliding's not all bad though. Just like if the friction is very low, if we put the friction very high, every movement we make, the wheels will attempt to translate that into the direction that the car is heading. So as we're turning, those wheels are gripping so hard that the forward momentum we've got can actually flip the car over when those wheels grip onto the ground. That is one of the big problems with high friction. When you start to turn, the wheels start to grip and you start to roll. Let's correct that. Ugh. That's an even bigger problem on servers than it is in single player. Sudden changes in directions on servers don't tend to end well, and friction makes sudden changes in directions much more likely. That's why, if you look for any written advice on how to set up your suspension, most people will be talking about setting your friction as low as you can get away with. It makes it much safer to drive around on servers. For single player, I tend to have it somewhere in the low, almost always below 50%, but usually around the 30% mark. You'll find your own sweet spot for how you like to drive. I am definitely not considering myself an expert on what's the best, because I think the best depends on your vehicle and your driving style. For damping, strength and all these ones, down to suspension travel, we're going to need to look at a different rig. But for now, let's have a look at our speed limit. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Often you will actually want to speed limit your vehicle. If we set this thing to unlimited, let's see what happens. Typically, everything will go alright while I'm traveling at low speeds. Let's get our HUD up so we can see what speed we're traveling at. So 45, 50, oh. As we reach higher speeds, the physics system has to keep up with a large number of interactions. If any of these go a little bit badly, you significantly increase the chance of your vehicle doing something that makes no sense and flipping, exploding, all sorts of bad things. So lower speeds tend to be safer within the physics system. The other thing to keep in mind is, if you go over a bump fast, it might be enough to actually jump off the ground. And if you're suspension isn't set up well enough to take the sort of drop you're going to hit, it might bottom out and end very poorly. For single player, when I've played, usually somewhere between the 80 and 120 kilometers an hour speed, you can get away with a lot of vehicles, especially small grid ones. You may need to go a little slower for large grid, just to play it safe. Before we talk about the other suspension settings, let's take a look at the suspension. You've got the wheel and it's attached by this pin to the suspension. That pin is able to move along the suspension within the boundaries that you set and in the way that you tell it to. So what I've set up here to explore how each of those settings work, there's a little rig with our wheels highlighted and named. So we've got our left on our character's left and our right on our character's right. And if we press Shift K, we can actually take control of that vehicle and we can start playing around with these suspension settings. First one to look at, let's start at the top, is damping. Let's set our strength right down to 1%, so it's got a little bit. And our left wheels are going to have damping at 0. Our right wheels are also going to have strength at 1, but their damping is going to be 100%. Damping is a measure of how resistant the wheel will be to movement along the suspension track. You can almost think of it like friction on the suspension track. It's something that will slow movement in any direction along it. So with maximum force to that, what we're going to expect to see on this test is the left wheels, which have no damping, to spring completely out of the way as this comes in contact with the landing zone. The right wheels, on the other hand, may resist and may even stay exactly where they are, but if they do move, because we've got no strength on the suspension, they should stay right where they are. So let's see what happens. 3, 2, 1, drop. And you could see that was exactly what happened. These left wheels, they went straight up to the top without doing anything at all. These right wheels, they initially resisted and then they've gone up. Now, if we take control of this again and turn on our thrusters, as we lift up, you'll see something. Whoop, this is hard to pilot. There we go. You see something interesting happen. The left wheels again drop straight back down to their position because nothing's holding them in place. These right wheels, because the damping is set so high, gravity is not strong enough to pull them back down against that resistance. Or, no, it's just barely strong enough, I think. Yeah. So it's just slowly pulling it down, and that's because that damping is doing everything it can to keep the wheel where it is on the suspension. This damping force will be applied whether the wheel is moving because of bumps that the vehicle's hit, or whether it's moving because the suspension is trying to push itself back to its original resting position. And we'll look into the effect that has shortly. First though, we need to have a look at the strength parameter of the suspension. We'll look at strength on its own first, and then we'll have a look at the two in concert. So, we've seen what damping does. Let's put this at, we'll have this at 0% for both sides. Strength is the amount of force that is going to be applied to push a wheel back to its default position. And the default position is this height offset. So if we look at our left wheels, you can see them raise up as I push this height offset higher, and you see them sink down as I push it lower. That is what is considered, that's what I'd consider to be the default position. We can push it up or down, and the strength will try and push it back to that position. So we'll leave the left wheels at 1% and damping at 0. The right wheels, we're going to turn our damping down to 0. We're going to put our strength up to 100%. Same height offset of -50. And then we'll see what happens with these. So before we do that, we'll level off the test, and then it should lock. Yep. Turn off our thrusters. And in 3, 2, 1, drop. You can see the effect that the strength parameter had there. These wheels barely budged, if they even budged at all. These ones, the suspension is kind of giving them free movement to do whatever they need to get out of the way. Not hugely helpful if you're wanting these things to soften an impact, as all they'll do is get out of the way and allow you to smash straight onto your suspension. Equally, at full strength, this isn't doing much to soften the impact either, because all it's doing is creating a rigid body, which is the wheel attached to the suspension, to transmit that force into the ship as well. If we instead do this test with a more balanced setting... Oh dear. Oopsie! I might have wanted slightly less lift force. Let's have a look at the effect of strength again, with a slightly more normal setting. Let's put the lefts up to 10%, and we'll put the rights down to, let's say, 70%. We're still going to expect the right wheels to stay more rigid, but they should have a little bit of give. The left, on the other hand, should probably give the whole way, but we'll do it much more slowly than last time. Let's see if that's the case. You can see there's a whole lot of bounce on those left wheels. They take in most of the force, and then they kind of wobble a bit. And that's because they're only providing a little bit of force in resistance to the drop. Whereas these ones, apart from the first landing, they just remained rigid. The last test with the strength parameter of the suspension showed that the left side of the vehicle actually bounced a lot. That's not just related to strength, that's also related to the damping force. And this ends up being a good opportunity to demonstrate why you want some degree of damping. If you hit a small bump in a road, it will have a tendency to make a suspension system without any damping bump up and down, bounce up and down like you're on a pogo stick. Not very helpful. So you want some degree of damping to reduce that oscillation. If we have our wheel suspensions set with strength of 10%, we'll put one of them a damping up to 50%, and we'll put the right side with damping at, let's do 15%. We should see more bounce on the right than on the left. Let's test that. In 3, 2, 1, drop. And you can see that that right side bounces, whereas the left side, it initially did have some give, and we'll drop that again just to reconfirm. Drop again in 3, 2, 1. The left side shouldn't bounce as much, but should have some give. The right side will bounce a lot and have the tiniest bit more give. And you can see that's exactly what happened. We softened the initial impact, but then on the left side, it stopped the vehicle from being flung back up into the air again. That's why you need some damping, and that's why it's really handy to have at the right level for the terrain and the vehicle that you're traveling with. Next, we'll look at suspension travel, and this is one of the last things we need to look at. Suspension travel is the distance along this suspension that the wheel is allowed to move. So it can either move the whole way from the top to the bottom, or you can stop it part way along. Let's see the effects that changing this have on these wheels. So let's set our left ones. So the suspension travel is 10%. And the right wheels, we'll leave it 100. And 3, 2, 1, drop. What we saw there was, being honest, me not thinking through the test before I dropped it, but a useful example anyway. It showed that the strength and the damping were enough that the suspension travel didn't even come into play. In some ways, this should be our aim. We'd want any bumps to be absorbed fully by the suspension and the suspension not to bottom out. I would try and control my suspension travel through adjusting the damping and adjusting the strength, not limiting the suspension travel. An exception to that would be if you have any blocks underneath your vehicle that will contact with the ground if the suspension travel is set high enough. To see the effect that suspension travel has, let's drop our damping right down to 10% and make that change on both sides of wheels. Let's try that test again. 3, 2, 1, drop. So you can see that even though the strength and the damping are set the same, because the right wheels are allowed to travel along their suspension and the left wheels aren't, this side actually provided more bounce and softened the blow of that drop more so than the left side did. If we again jump in, and whoops, those gyros might be a little too powerful. Let's be a bit more careful. And we drop our right side strength all the way down. And we drop our left side strength all the way down. You can see the full range of this movement. So that's at 100%. That's how far the wheels are allowed to move. That's at 10%. That's how far those are allowed to move. If we again jump in and we adjust the left-sided wheels and we gradually increase this suspension travel, you'll see that the vehicle's going to slowly drop as that value increases. Because gravity wants to push it all the way to its limit because the strength is so low that it's not doing anything. As we reduce our travel, we can lift it back up. So if you've got a small block underneath your vehicle that's sticking out low and you need to have the suspension only work to 20%, otherwise that thing will hit the ground and you'd rather have your suspension bottom out before you hit that, this is how you set that value. And that's what that's useful for. If you need to adjust height for a connector, adjusting strength works a bit better. Hopefully that little trip into testing these suspensions will help you guys set up your wheeled vehicles in the future so that you can drive them the way you like. One other thing you can do with your wheel suspensions, if you want to drive them this way, is set your friction fairly low and then instead of steering with the wheels, steer with gyros. You can get a kind of slidey, ice skating-y sort of feeling with that. And at higher speeds, sometimes that can be a better or easier way to steer. It's also handy to have gyros in case you do manage to jump, because then instead of landing on one wheel, you can do your best to land on all 4 of them or 5 of them or 12 of them or however many you've got, so that all of the suspensions together are softening the blow. Like, oh no! Well, I almost saved that. I hope this was useful to you guys. There's always plenty more to come, so I'll see you then.